All right, we're going. Cool. Welcome to Class 7. Today, we're going to talk about modeling clothing. So we've talked a little bit about Blender and how Blender works and how to work with vertices and weight painting. So I think we've now covered a lot of the essentials to be able to go make clothes. This will mostly just be me going to go make like a shirt on an Evi. So that's the plan. We're just going to start. Feel free to follow along if you'd like. If you would like to share your screen as you follow along, that's also welcome. Or if you just want to watch, that's okay too. I'm going to be trying to go through a pretty breakneck pace here as I have a lot that I want to cover. And as usual, we'll be doing a workshop for an hour after class or till 10 o'clock if I go over, which I probably will go over. I usually do, to work on whatever you want to work on. Ask questions, et cetera, et cetera. So firstly, plugins. I just installed screencast keys on my Blender, which allows me to show you all what buttons I'm pressing. So if you're ever curious, just look down here at the bottom left. Hopefully that will give you an idea of what I'm using. Other than that, I have Cat's Blender plugin installed. We've installed that in previous classes. Obviously very important. I don't think we're going to need anything else other than... there's a couple of these add mesh that I find really useful. Add extra objects, curve tools. I'm just going to scroll through all of them real quick just to see if there's any of them that I really think you need to have. Obviously, Sense Robust Weight Painting Tool. Loop tools. Use loop tools. It's great. Quad Remesher is also quite cool. And then there's also Retopo Flow. I think I've put links to all of these things above. If you have any questions, let me know. We're not going to use Quad Remesher or Retopo Flow today, but we will probably use loop tools at least a little bit. Cool. So the first thing we're going to talk about is vertex manipulation. We kind of covered in Blender how to work with the viewport and move around, but we never really covered how to like actually work with verts. So I'm going to hit Control or Shift A here to make a new mesh. I'm going to go ahead and just make a circle. As we create the circle down here, we can see the number of vertices we have. So if I'm making a shirt, it's going to be good for me to decide ahead of time how many polys I want. This can be a lower number than what you're going to want because you can subdivide later, but it should not be a ridiculously high number. If you start with a 200 poly or 200 vert circle, your end mesh is going to be pretty ridiculous and you're going to want to like retopologize it, and that's going to be a whole thing. So 32 is fine, I think. I don't think there's anything wrong with that idea. So if we're going to make a shirt, we have to kind of think about, well, what are the vertices that are going to go into that? And the very first thing we want is a circle that encompasses the body. Seems kind of obvious, but you know. So to take that circle, I'm going to hit G, and then Z to lock it to the Z axis, move it up, and then S, scale it outwards, and then S and Y to scale it inwards a little bit, G and Y to move it forward a little bit. And we have kind of the base of the shirt there. That's kind of where I'm going to want the shirt to end on the body. As I've already covered here with G to move axes, X, Y, and Z to lock your things to axes. Shift X, Y, and Z will move it on every axis but that axis, which is kind of cool. So if I hold G and then Shift Z, I can move it anywhere around on the X and Y plane and keep it in the same place on the Z plane. Very useful. And then a couple of other things we will work with as we continue onwards here. Some nice things about visualization as we work here. I like to kind of set myself up in a workflow that works well for me. One thing I like to do is use this matte cap view. So up here in the top right, under our viewport shading options in matte cap, we can change the matte cap. I like using this kind of default matte cap view. This will allow us to see the curves of our object better from a 2D perspective, especially if we're not really moving around our viewport very often. Sometimes our brains have a hard time like figuring out what we're looking at in the 3D space. So matte caps can help with that because you can see the normal direction of any given point. We're going to use X-ray view on and off here, which is Alt-Z. So if you see me pressing that, that's what I'm doing. I also like to enable wireframe mode, which is this toggle right here under viewport overlays. I turn down the opacity down to about a quarter. This shows you all of the wireframe of the object as you're working, regardless of if you're in edit mode or object mode. Normal direction. Every once in a while, we're going to need to use this face orientation option over here in the viewport overlays. This will show us the direction of the normals of any object. So if we have, say, a square or any object, really, there is a direction the normals face and a direction the normals don't face. The anti-normal? I don't know. So that direction is red. This direction is blue. Typically, we're going to want to see blue everywhere. There are certain cases where we're comfortable seeing the other side of a mesh. But typically you don't want that. So I'm going to use that face orientation mode every once in a while to double check I'm doing things correctly. And lastly, orthographic versus perspective views. You're going to see me use this every once in a while here. So on my numpad, there's probably another option. I'm not sure how to do that without a numpad if you don't have one. We can use 1, 3, 7, 9 to toggle into orthographic view. What orthographic view is if I like, cool, sure. Okay. So if we have a camera, this is our camera, and we have an object. This is our object. If we're looking at perspective view looks kind of similar to how we would look at it in real life. So you have your light rays coming outwards at an angle towards the object. And as such, you see vertices kind of, the lines you see aren't straight lines. Like, you kind of extend this line outwards. If we're in an orthographic view, instead, all light rays come in parallel to the object. So if we're seeing lines, they are the true normal, like the true axis of whatever you're trying to look at. And so, we can kind of continue to draw all those lines out. So if you see perspective view, this is our normal view. This is like actually looking at the 3D model from a normal perspective. Swapping to orthographic view with numpad 1 gives us everything from straight angles. And you can see that's represented by the background here. The grid is, well, orthogonal, hence orthographic. So if we're looking at our vertices in this view, we can swap to edit mode. Anything that's on this, anything that's collinear, coplanar, whatever you want to call it, on this axis will look like a straight line. So for example, if I wanted to grab everything on the left side of the mesh, this is really easy in this mode because I can just click and drag, get really close to the edge there, and bam, I've now grabbed every single vertex in the left side of the mesh and none on the right. That would be really difficult in perspective view because if you kind of see if I look at it in perspective view, it's not perfectly aligned. You have to like go get your camera exactly right. It's weird, right? So that's why I'll use orthographic view sometimes to be able to better visualize the model and better select vertices. In addition, a lot of times our clothing is going to be symmetrical, right? So if we're making a shirt, at least at the beginning stages of the shirt, it's going to look the same on the left and the right, unless you're making an intentional decision for it not to be. And that's fine too. But we're going to make something mostly symmetrical today, and then maybe we're going to sculpt it to be a little bit asymmetrical at the very end of the process to give it a little bit of flavor, right? A little bit of real life-ism. That's realism. That's the word, not real life-ism. Dear God. So if we're going to be working with something that is mirrored on the left and right sides, we might as well only work with half a mesh. We don't really need to work with the whole mesh. We can just use half of the vertices, aka we don't need all of these. So I'm going to take all of these on this one side and delete them. And then I'm going to go add a mirror modifier under the modifiers tab on the right here. Mirror modifier will mirror all of your vertices across your origin point. In this case, my origin point is in the center on the x-axis. So if I mirror on the x-axis, we will get our oval back, just like we had it before. But now we only have the vertices on one side and not the other. So as we build up this whole thing, we don't really have to worry about symmetricality. We can instead just enable mesh symmetry up here in the top right and work with it this way. That's really dealer's choice. I kind of prefer to at least start my model like this. So with that, we can start working on actual modeling stuff. Another note is I used the slash on my keyboard to just show the one model and ignore everything else in the scene, which I will use very frequently. So to actually start working on our shirt, what is a shirt other than, you take our half circle and we're going to extrude this line up the side of the body, right? So I'm going to hit E, selecting my mesh, and go in and select it this way. Now there is some weirdness we're going to see with the center here kind of overlapping now because I'm kind of moving the mesh inwards as I go. This might be a case to actually not be using the mirror modifier to start off on our mesh. But to fix this, if you would like to, you can select whatever vertices are overlapping, go to vertex, and then snap to symmetry. There is a maximum threshold distance. You might have to bump way up for it to actually snap correctly to your symmetrical area. It did not seem to work. There we go. Cool. So bumping up that threshold, negative X to X, snap to symmetry, it fixed itself. That's kind of a huge pain. I'm not sure if there is a shortcut for that. There is not. That's interesting. We could also just go ahead and remove mirror mode for the sake of creating the base mesh and go from there. So I'm actually just going to go do that real quick. That will make things a little bit easier to start off. countermanding my own earlier instructions. That's good teaching. So working with this, we can now extrude upwards. I'm going to hit E and then Z to extrude vertically, and then I'm going to scale and move it inwards, right? So we can kind of follow the shape of the body. To select a whole edge loop like I just did, so selecting this whole bottom, I shift and left, or alt and left click, and that selects that whole loop. I can take that loop and kind of move it in towards the body here. And I can go ahead and just do the same thing all the way up. So I'm going to hit E, Z, scale, E, Z, scale, E, Z, scale. I'm trying to keep these relatively consistent in size. Now we can always subdivide them later. It's a lot more difficult to recombine them, but we can remove edge loops when we need to. So like, let's say I make an edge loop and I think, oh, I made this one too close to the next one, kind of like this. If you ever want to be able to remove a whole edge loop, that's pretty easy. I hit 2 to go into edge mode, alt click to select the whole edge loop, hit delete, and then dissolve edges. And that will just cleanly remove that whole loop for you, so you don't have to worry about it. There'll be other cases here, especially like around the torso area, where we're going to want to scale in just one direction, not others. And we can kind of continue up this chain, making a very, very, very rough outline of what we're going to want at the end of the day. It won't look very good right now. That's okay. And then we can do the same thing on the arms, right? Same dealio. You can model these separately or together, your choice. It makes sense to me to just do them separately for now, so I can use the mirror modifier to get both sleeves done at the same time. And I'm going to make a long sleeve shirt, or at least like probably like halfway down the lower arm. So I'm going to make a new mesh. It is a circle. Go place it approximately where it's supposed to be. Add the mirror modifier. One thing worth noting, if I had the mirror modifier right now, it will not mirror across the center correctly just on its own, because the mirror object is itself, so it mirrors along its own origin. I moved the circle, so the origin moved with it, and mirroring will not mirror correctly across the body. To do that, you just select your mirror object. So I'll go ahead and select this body 001. And now it mirrors correctly off to the side, as we can see over here. So then I can go ahead and make this sleeve look approximately correct. So I can R, Y. You can also type to get rotations in. So in this case, I can hit R, Y, 90, for example. And that will do a 90-degree rotation across the Y-axis. Move it, scale it, same things as before. And then go extrude my faces. One thing I've already noticed I did accidentally is I made another 32 vertex circle for my sleeve. That is way too much. I could just remake the circle, or I could go ahead and attempt to dissolve half of it. There's lots of different ways to handle this problem. Since we made the mistake early, I'm going to go ahead and just fix it by recreating and making a new circle. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we probably want a lot less verts for our sleeve, maybe even as low as 10. Let's go for 16. Having like an even multiple of the number of vertices you have on your body doesn't really matter. A lot of times what you're looking for more of is relative consistency when it comes to the amount of space each quad covers, especially when it comes to any density that needs to happen for joints. As we've talked about in previous classes, topology really matters when we're going to be weight painting, that we have lots of topology around our joints because we want our mesh to deform smoothly. And also more topology in general also makes it so that we are going to run into clipping less, because it has a more granularity to its weight painting. And more granularity in the weight painting means that when we do our weight transfer and when we manually weight paint, we have finer control over how each vertex gets manipulated. So I re-added the mirror, I re-add the mirror object, and we're back here now with only 16 verts. Cool. And I can go do the thing, right? So I can go take our sleeve, extrude, 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 extrude. And I was in a rush and made this one kind of not really the same size as the others. That's not really a big deal. We can go back to our edge, select the whole edge loop like we just did, and we can either go move it manually by hitting G and just kind of sliding it along, or there's a really cool tool that we can use. I use this all the time. You can hit G twice, and it will move everything across existing edges. So it will find an existing edge that's appropriate to move your vertice or edge loop or edge, whatever, and it will move it right across that line, which is really cool because you can just slide it across. Phenomenally neat. So I kind of recentered it here, put it in the middle, and I could do the same for the rest of these if I really cared to. It's worth noting that shrink wrap is potentially an option here if you want to try it. I personally don't, but you can. Shrink wrapping will take your mesh and kind of find the nearest face on another target mesh and snap it to it. And you can even add a little bit of padding. So I can just try that real quick with these sleeves. I could add a shrink wrap modifier, shrink onto the body, and give it potentially a little bit of an offset. And bam, you see a very well-fitted sleeve. I could probably do the same thing for the shirt. Add a little bit of offset. Now it starts to really mess with the topology. Not really. The topology itself isn't a big deal, but your edge loops are all not very straight. They're all jagged. They're all over the place. There's probably a better way to fix that with some different wrap methods. Looks like project seems to work pretty nicely if I lower down the offset. But you can see that it starts to make things kind of weird. I'd prefer not to bother with that right now, so I'm going to remove that shrink wrap modifier. On the arms, it actually turned out really nicely. That's actually, like, I could just keep that. I'm not going to, but I could. Let me double check my notes here. We're flying by. Any questions so far? Cool. I also do have the chat open for the class, so feel free to just put anything you want to in there. So covered normal directions, the solidify modifier. So we typically are making clothes out of just one dimension. And we can actually see that again in our face orientation like we discussed earlier. Funny enough, our face orientation got flipped. Oh no, everything's red on the outside. We can fix that. I'll go on my tangent, pun intended, about normals here in a second. But to go fix your normals by flipping them around, you can have it recalculate them. To recalculate them in edit mode, select your whole mesh with A, and then Shift N. Shift N will automatically try to find exterior facing, like which direction faces outwards, and apply your normals that way. And it applied it correctly. You can also flip that if you want to by clicking this inside on the recalculate normals options. And I can do the same thing with the body. Swap back to edit mode to change my target. Swap to edit mode on the body, A, Shift N, and bam, we're done. Typically, most clothing you're going to make is going to only be, it's going to be flat. There's going to be no interior geometry because that interior geometry would be unnecessary. You don't need to see it. You can use a solidify modifier to go add some interior geometry. And there are cases to go do that. A good example for me recently was I was making a sweatshirt and I wanted a hood for the sweatshirt. The hood is not, you see the whole hood, both the bottom of the hood and the top of the hood when it's on and when it's not on, when it's on the back, So you do need to be able to have an interior texture and an exterior texture. And you can't just have a different texture for the inside and outside of a same rectangle. It will be the same thing. So if you need to get that extra texturing, you can go ahead and solidify. So we can take our modifiers, go to solidify here, give it a little bit more thickness, and you can see, bam, it made cubes effectively out of our entire mesh, right? So it projected it inwards and then added an edge here. You can also make it not fill the edge in if you want to. You can see that all that space on the inside there. A bunch of other options as a part of the solidify modifier here. We will not be needing it today, but I wanted to at least mention that it does exist. You can also, for what it's worth, use, there's a couple of other options you can play around with, like the offset, which is basically which direction it applies the new geometry in, whether it's outside of the existing mesh or inside the existing mesh. But we can see here now that both the inside and the outside have normals that face the correct directions, and they are independent quads. This quad is different from this quad down in, I don't know why it won't let me select it, but you get the point. The different quads. Why will it not let me select it? What is going on? Oh, you can't select quads that don't exist yet. This solidify modifier has not been applied to the model. So I'm trying to click on this quad. This quad doesn't actually exist. In fact, if you click on this right here, you can toggle off the real-time view of your modifiers in the viewport to see what your topology actually currently looks like. And then you can reapply it to see what it will look like when you apply the modifier. To apply the modifier, you can hit apply down here. You have to be in object mode to do so. And I can apply the solidify, and now that geometry is real, so I can go actually select it. So you can see I have a quad on the inside and a quad on the outside. Similar location, similar shape, but they are different and could have different textures. For what I mentioned with like the hoodie, for example, that's why you'd want to do that. Now, we typically aren't going to need that because we aren't going to be looking at the inside of a sleeve. There's a good way to trick ourselves into, let me undo the solidify here. The edges of objects sometimes can look really weird. Sometimes creators, if they don't use a solidify, if they don't make this have thickness, Sometimes you can actually just go look down the sleeve and see, you see the topology that's two-dimensional. It generally doesn't look like it has thickness. You see the same texture on the inside and the outside. That's wicked. Very funny. And the lighting is off too. That's another thing, is the interior side of normals. The lighting is calculated from the normal direction, not the anti-normal direction. So it can look a little bit strange. So to do that, a lot of times with clothing, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to project with extrusion here inwards, and then scale down into the base mesh. So especially if my sleeve is a little bit smaller, I'm going to kind of make it more form-fitting here towards the end. Sure, that works, whatever. If I want it to look like the sleeve actually has some thickness to it, I can actually just kind of merge it right into the base mesh. So I'm going to extrude. If I hit extrude to E and then right click, it just duplicates the geometry on the inside of it. So you'll see me hit E and then right click all the time. And then scale to move it inwards here. I can move it out a little bit to give it kind of like a rounded edge. And then E, right click, scale, move, E, right click, scale, move, and kind of continue to do that until I get to the point where I can actually just scale it really far into the mesh. Like use X-ray here to kind of see, I can kind of really nudge it in there. But it will look like you just have normal clothing, right? Even though we are definitely clipping in, it just looks like a normal sleeve. Doesn't look anything odd. And this is a really nice way of handling that problem, because it looks like this shirt has thickness, right? It looks like it's bulky. But you don't have to deal with actually adding thickness to the interior of the mesh. And I can go around and continue to play with a lot of this stuff here, kind of getting a rough shape of what I want before I go into sculpting. There's also obviously the problem of, reapply this here so you can see both sides of the sleeve, connecting the torso to the sleeve. And that is a pain in the butt. There are probably going to be better ways of showing you how to do this than what I have. I am still learning, but we try our best. So the rough way I like to do this is to consider the top of the shirt and the bottom of the shirt. So I have made all of this down here. I have not made the collar area. I could just go make a collar area. So I could, in edit mode, I'm actually going to go ahead and create a circle using Shift A, which will make it as a part of the same mesh, drag it up here to the collar, and go find about where I want the collar of this shirt to live. Right around there. Cool. Sure. And then I can go ahead and extend that out a little bit. Normal directions are wrong, but that's fine. I'm actually going to turn off normal face orientation mode for now. Go back to our matcap mode and start to kind of figure out what this will look like up here, just to the best of our ability. Now we're going to need to be able to connect together these sides. So a way of doing this is to kind of start to select the geometry from one, select the geometry from the other, and then bridge them together. It's a good way to start. To do that, we have to join these meshes. And to join the meshes, we have to apply our mirror modifier. Here is whereabouts we can actually just go apply mirror modifiers on both sides by chopping off half of the mesh. So I'm going to go into orthographic view like I discussed earlier, go select the verts on one side, delete them. And now if I join together these two meshes, we can use the mirror modifier for the whole thing and just deal with half of our shirt. Need to do the same thing up top here. Cool. So to start joining these things together, we could manually join them. That is an option available to us. We can take two vertices, hit F to join them together. You could even subdivide them by clicking on the edge and hitting subdivide, and you get a new vert here you can mess with. And we can go around this whole thing. We can go select a vert, subdivide it here, select these four verts and hit F to make a plane together. Select these four verts. And then, oh, look, there's this one in the middle here. So now we're going to have an n-gon. How do we deal with the n-gon? Topology is hard. Well, you can make tries out of this. One thing you could do is you can knife tool. So I can hit K, go over here, click this, click this, click this, and it's going to make a new edge across here and split these faces up. So now I have these three faces here. We typically try to work in quads because we get nice clean edge loops. So as I go to edit to edge mode and hit Alt click to select my edge, I can nice and cleanly manipulate these edges. Same with going along this other axis here. I can select this whole line going all the way down. But notice how the line stops here now at this place where we've made a bunch of tries, because it's not a clean topology anymore. We've lost our ability to work in that way. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that there are times to just deal with tries. There's a whole class of knowledge around making good quad topology that first off, I am bad at. And second off, I don't think that noobs need to know. Know that it exists. Know that good quad topology makes for a nice, clean workflow, makes your life a lot easier, and then go learn it later when you have time. Prioritize learning things that are actually going to be useful to you right now. So I just described this whole way of being able to join things together manually. That's a huge pain. It's a massive pain, and there's a better way of handling it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all the work I just did. Another way we can go ahead and try to merge these things together is by bridging edge loops. Typically, you have to have a similar amount of geometry, but we're just going to kind of wing it and see what works. So if I select this vertex here, and then this vertex over here, what do I want to be doing here? Is it control click? Oh, edge mode. So if I go to edge mode, select this edge, and then control click to this other edge, it will try to find a line that meets one edge to the other and allow you to select across the entire length of that. That can be nice if you're trying to select, like, this whole line across the top here, for example. Instead of selecting the whole line where I use alt click, I can select one edge and then control click on another edge, and it will fill the gap. It's a pick shortest path is the name of that command that it's performing. So to bridge edge loops, I can go ahead and select a bunch of edges over here, and then select a bunch of edges over here. Try to get them approximately similar, both in edge count and in location. It doesn't have to be perfect. Then I can right click, Loop Tools, Bridge, and bam, just like that, we now have the connection between our collar and our shirt. It's not perfect. We're going to need a little bit of work to really improve this, but it's a good start. We can do the same thing down at the bottom, right? So we can go ahead and select 4 edges down here and 4 edges over here. Loop Tools, Bridge, bam. There you go. We are going to want to do a lot of work in the armpit in particular. Armpits are a huge pain to work with because, as you can imagine, when you are moving your arms in full body tracking, there's a huge range of motion that little tiny area of the mesh has to go through. There's a funny conversation to be had here about A pose versus T pose. You might see some people who are purists about one or the other. Oftentimes, A pose is touted to be better for animation because it's a more natural pose for a human being. And oftentimes, when you're looking at video games, human beings are in more natural poses. But oftentimes, as we've seen in VRC, people go wild and crazy with full body tracking and put themselves in all sort of contorted positions, as one does. So you'll see lots of stretching of geometry, and that can be really annoying to deal with. So you'll often see pretty dense geometry down in the armpit area to make both the weight painting and the stretching of the textures a little bit more uniform and nice. So I can kind of continue to do the same thing that I was doing over here. I can make the front and the back. I'm going to make those independently. So to do that, I'm going to select a bunch of edges across here and extrude and bring them up. Scale them in a little bit and kind of do this to make the front of the shirt. Not really worrying too much about that symmetry that I'm messing around with right now, partially just due to time, as this is gonna take a while, and we're already, 35 minutes into the class. Cool. Yikes. And we can go ahead and bridge edge loops. We do not have to have the same number of edges to bridge edge loops. This is important to know. So if I take this number, this is 6 edges, and then this over here, which is just 2, it will make it work. So if I go over here and bridge, it will make tries. Loop Tools is awesome at this, by the way. It will just make tries to make it work approximately correctly. As I mentioned earlier, this is not good topology. It's not really good form. We're not going to worry about it too much. And then I'm going to snap to symmetry here best I can. If you also want to make your mirror modifier a little bit more robust to vertexes that aren't perfectly at the center, you can change this merge distance here. And when you make it big enough, it will eventually just realize that you meant to put this in the center, even though it's not perfectly in the center. You can also, of course, use our sidebar here to go change the X position to make sure that it is perfectly centered. That is actually not going to work because of our origin point. When I merged those two meshes earlier, I did not pay attention to where I put our origin point, and it put it way over here. Pretty terrible. So our transform here is not going to zero out correctly, and that's okay. For now, we can just wing it. It's also why our symmetrize didn't work correctly. Symmetrize just goes based upon your origin point. It doesn't worry about any modifiers you have, the mirror modifier in particular. So I'm going to go ahead and mess around with this a little bit, make it look nice. We are not striving for perfection today. And then I can go ahead and bridge these guys too, right? Kind of complete the whole cycle here. So I could take this edge. I'm on the wrong side. Take this edge down here, take this edge over here, and bridge edge loops. And bam, that is almost a shirt. Looks pretty ugly. Sometimes you have this manual thing, you're just gonna have to go fill this yourself. There might be a nicer way. I just go to vertex mode, select the 3 verts, hit F, and you have a try there. That's good enough for now. Same thing with the back, right? I can speed run this real quick here. Select all this stuff, extrude, extrude, extrude. Connect all this up with a bridge. Connect all this up with a bridge. Move around our verts to make a little bit more sense. Connect things together as we have to. And we have a shirt. It's a very ugly shirt, but it's a shirt nonetheless. Now, we can start immediately going into retopologizing here. There's lots of topology to fix. We can also try to smooth out some of the mistakes we've made. And that's probably a good option at this point, to be honest with you. One thing, firstly, that I need to do is move my cursor back to the center here, move the object's origin back to the center. I actually am not super sure how to do that. That's awkward. We can, oh, I know. Cool. My 3D cursor, which is this guy down here, is currently at the origin point 0, 0, 0. You can move your origin of any object to the cursor, which in this case will be very convenient because it's at 0, 0, 0. And that's good enough for me. So I can right click on my object in object mode, set origin, origin to 3D cursor, and bam, now our little orig dot is at the same point as our 3D cursor. That cursor can be useful for other operations. I'm honestly not super familiar. I don't use it very often. But what's important now is that our snap to symmetry will work correctly. So if I go select that vertex that was a little bit off earlier, select mesh, snap to symmetry, it will actually go put itself in the right place. If the threshold were high enough. It still failed to do so. I think probably because it was already at the right point, and then that's why I considered it to be failing. Or not. Cool. I don't know what's going on. Doesn't matter. You get the point. Cool. The bottom of the shirt and the top of the shirt, we can do the same thing we discussed earlier to make it look like it has thickness, right? So we can take this, we can extrude, we can scale inwards. Kind of continue to do that same thing over and over and over again. This will look weird because this is a robot model. You might want to consider waiting to do this until after we have done our sculpting. So in fact, I am going to do that. I'm going to go select all those edges I just made, delete all the verts. Probably going to do the same thing over here because we're going to need to do a lot of fixing to this model to make sure it looks good on the body. To do that, we're going to sculpt. This is where we can actually go enter sculpt mode here and go do the thing. So I can go ahead in sculpt mode and firstly, I could use smooth to start to fix some of our topology and kind of make it a little bit more simple. There's a shortcut to smooth, which is just hold shift and click. And we can kind of move along our mesh here and use the smooth tool. And already it's looking pretty good. It's going to start to clip into the chest there. That's fine. That's normal. One more thing to note here. If I'm on the wrong side of the mesh here, the side that we don't actually have any real geometry, again, because we have mirror mode on, sculpt doesn't do anything. You'll notice that there is a yellow dot on the vertex that is the center of your sculpt. So if I'm over here, there's no yellow dot. It's not actually doing anything. So I go over to the actual correct side of the model, do more smoothing. Notice as I tried to smooth all of this here, it did things I don't like to that geometry. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete that geometry. I mentioned it earlier. It had its purpose, but we're going to go recreate it at some later point. Use Shift-Alt-Click to select multiple edge loops at a time and delete. Cool. So now I can go back to my sculpt mode and smoothing. And it's starting to look kind of like a real shirt. Slowly but surely. Took a little while. Smooth mode, when you have things perfectly aligned on their correct axes, will understand that you want symmetry and not mess with it if you have symmetry mode enabled. So I'm going to get all of my vertexes at approximately the right spot here and then turn on symmetry over here. Even though we aren't working with a mesh on the other side, it will recognize that we don't want to mess with this. I say as it doesn't recognize that. I've lied to you. That's pretty cool. I think you might have to actually have applied your mirror modifier for this to work correctly. So if I apply the mirror modifier and now turn on symmetry, it still doesn't work correctly. Wow, that's cool. Oh, there we go. My symmetry didn't apply the first time because I hit Alt-Z or Control-Z to undo, and it undid the symmetry modifier. So if I apply the mirror and then turn on the X symmetry, my sculpting will correctly... Okay, I'm missing something. Hold on. Very strange. What have I done wrong? I don't know. Whatever. We're we're not going to worry about it for right now. We'll just go manually move those vertexes back into place using that snap to symmetry if we mess up anything. In the interest of time, we'll come back to it. So I've smoothed out a lot of these vertexes here, and notice we have something that more resembles a normal shirt at this point. A bunch of our geometry still sucks. We'll come back to it later. I can also go ahead and move it around to start looking more like a real shirt. So I can use draw mode or grab mode. Either one works pretty well for this purpose. And go ahead and kind of move things around. To change the radius, you can hit F and then move your mouse around to get bigger or smaller. And then same with changing your strength. A super strong brush will move things drastically. A weak brush will move things just a little bit as you move your mouse around. You can also change the stroke fall off here. This can be useful. So this is basically as you go farther away from the center point, how much does it affect the mesh? Smooth is the default and typically what you're going to want, but there are times to use other ones like constant, for example. Constant, as you can see here, moves everything identically across the entire radius, which has its own value. You can make custom curves if you really want to. We're going to stick with smooth. It's pretty good. Does what we need. So we can go ahead and kind of move everything in more look like a real shirt. Move things out on the shoulder blades here. I keep doing things on the wrong side. We may notice that our geometry starts to get a little bit funky. We may notice, hey, we don't really have enough geometry here. We can use the knife tool to get around that. We can also subdivide to get around that. So if I select two edge loops, right click and hit subdivide, that did not do what I expected it to do actually. It was close. It effectively cut everything in half, right? It made half of the geometry. Now this has its own problems. One thing I mentioned that we are okay with tris, we are okay with quads. We are not okay with n-gons or anything that has 5 or more vertices on a face. By subdividing here, we have now split up this face into 5 separate points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we can move it around to prove that, right? You see 5 separate points. We are not okay with n-gons. N-gons have their own problems, not really worth working with. We can solve this via various different means. As I mentioned before with the knife tool, if you really wanted to go through the whole mesh and do it this way, you could. Triangularize everything. This is the simple way of turning your n-gons into tris and quads. There are more complex ways we're not going to discuss right now, mostly involving more complex geometry that I do not remember how to make right now. Oh well, doesn't matter. We're going to undo while they're back before we subdivided. There is definitely a way to cut 2 edges in half. I do not remember what it is. It's a little awkward, actually. Oh well, we'll come back to it. You can use knife tool. Good old knife tool, right? You click and drag across the whole mesh. And bam, 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 bam. Ooh, new edge loop. If you wanted to smooth this edge loop, again, we have access to our sculpt tool. You could right-click there, and it will kind of automatically bring your new edge loop into approximately a similar size as the rest of the quads around it. So if you decide you wanted more geometry around the shoulder blade, that's how I would do that. I noticed I applied that down the whole back. That's not technically necessary. If you want more geometry around the shoulder blade, you could just apply it up there and then do that similar trick I mentioned earlier. So I can like take this, go down to here, and then make tris out of it down here. And bam, now I have more geometry to work with around the shoulder blade to be able to sculpt a bit better. So if I sculpt here and go to grab, I can now kind of work better around this area of the mesh because it needs a little bit more detail to it. On that same point, if you make your mesh correctly from the get-go to do this, this can be kind of cool. You can apply subdivision surface or multi-res modifiers to your mesh. So subdivision surface basically takes every quad that you have and cuts it into quarters. So it'll divide everything up, and you can automatically apply that by hitting Control 2. Yeah, wow, crazy. Which will set your subdivision set. So you can do like Control 1, Control 2, Control 3, and it will make subsequently smaller and smaller polys. Now, this would be really bad to actually go try to make a clothing item. If I apply this multi-res modifier here, which I can't apply, because there's some oddities of multi-res, you can just make a subdivision surface instead to get the same effect, which is really dense geometry. If I apply this subdivision surface modifier, you have a lot of geometry to work with. Boy, sculpting will be really nice now because you get a lot of really detailed geometry to work with. Really cool. But your poly count will suffer pretty drastically. And we are always, as I mentioned in last class, we are always concerned about our poly count. especially if you're trying to release assets to sell to somebody. I'm going to judge your asset based upon the number of polys it has. Let's be real here. And then if you're trying to make it something for yourself and you want to keep it optimized, you have to keep your whole model under 70,000, right? We can go ahead and look at the statistics under viewport overlays to go see the number of tries on our mesh. And we are up to a whopping 42,000, which for a shirt is hilarious. So obviously we don't want this. One nice thing that subdivision surface modifier did do for us, you'll notice that we had some geometry that wasn't perfect over here where we made our shoulder blade into tries. It kind of automatically figured out how to make quads out of all of that, which is really cool. This is the way to make quads, by the way. If we ever are wanting to nerd out about topology, you can do these weird, like almost not parallelogram shapes, but trapezoid shapes, I guess, to merge together sections of your mesh that don't have the same number of vertexes to get quad topology throughout. So even though we're kind of playing around with the density of our vertexes, there are no tries here. It perfectly made quads out of everything.
So I have a question.
Go for it.
If you bump the density up just for the part when you're sculpting, and then once you've got your sculpting done, brought it back down just to make it easier to sculpt, would that work?
So there is technically unsubdivide that does exist, but it does not work well, and it will not care about the topology you so carefully crafted before. There's one other thing we are going to talk about that is directly related to that. And I'm going to go back here and show that off real quick. I think that's valuable to share. I am about 1/4 of my way through my notes for this class, so we're going to have a follow-on class. I'm not going to keep you for more than an hour, maybe an hour 15 at the worst case, because I respect your time. But I also have a whole bunch of things I want to discuss. So let's go ahead and get rid of this modifier that we made here. The more complicated version of the subdivision surface modifier is the multi-resolution modifier. The multi-resolution modifier, can you put that at the end, please? How do we tell it to put it at the end? Really? Multi-resolution cares about order. It's actually one of the only, I think it is actually the only modifier that will not allow you to move it. If you put it, if it moves past anything that changes the geometry of the mesh, and I will describe why here in a second once I figure out what the heck's going on. I've also broken a cardinal rule. I haven't saved in a while. Save incremental, Clara class 8. For now, I'm going to apply the mirror modifier just to show off what subdivisions, what multi-res does, because I don't really want to have to worry about it. So actually, we can just leave it in. It shouldn't be a big deal. Multi-resolution is very similar to subdivision surface, but it allows us to sculpt details into the mesh while it is still here. So we don't have to apply our subdivision surface to start sculpting with it. So if I change our multi-resolution here, have more levels, it's not letting me. Hello? Probably again, because the mirror modifier. That's causing a lot of issues. So we'll temporarily apply the mirror modifier to go keep working here. This is about the point where you could probably just keep your mirror modifier off, but because we haven't really fixed the topology around the shoulders up here, I'm going to not do that, but I'm going to do it just for the sake of showing off the multi-resolution. So apply multi-res. Now I should be able to, you have to hit subdivide, of course. You have to apply the multi-resolution modifier and then hit the subdivide button here. It's going to make our topology into much smaller quads. Then we can go over into sculpt mode and mess around with those new quads that are created at a much higher density, which is pretty dang cool. We're going to turn on mirror mode again here, X, which is still not doing what I'd expect it to do. Still don't know what's going on with that. Little annoying. Usually when sculpting with mirror modifier, it will correctly understand not to mess with your center point. Very strange. All right, whatever. So multi-resolution modifier allows us to sculpt our mesh, and it's non-destructive. So if I actually go back to our geometry, we haven't actually applied any difference in the geometry. All of that new data about the sculpt is stored within the modifier itself and only gets applied once we apply the multi-resolution modifier, which I can't do. I don't use this modifier very much. We're trying our best. Oh, I'm in edit mode. Still won't allow it in object mode? Cool. Oh, I hit tab and it went to sculpt mode. My bad. Go to object mode because you know what you're doing, and then hit apply. And now it applies all that sculpting data. This can also be used for something really cool that we can discuss later, which is to bake normal data into your mesh. So a lot of times if you're making game assets, and this is something that a lot of times you just don't do in VRC because you don't really need to, you will have two different versions of a mesh, a high poly version and a low poly version. And then you can effectively bake in the normal directions of the high poly version into the low poly version. There's a really good visual of this. I'll just go grab any old site that can talk about it. There was a picture of it somewhere. Boy, that's terrible. There we go. This picture. That's tiny. Awesome. Let's do one of these. Sure, good enough. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we can see here they made a high resolution model that has a ton of topology on it. It looks really detailed. Then they made a low resolution, which is literally just a cylinder, nothing else. What you can do is basically bake your normal maps to look like the higher resolution model. So this low res normal has the same amount of geometry as the low res, which is like literally 10 total quads or 10 total faces, and make it look like the higher resolution version. You can do that with Subdivision Surface, and it's pretty cool. So if I wanted to build a whole bunch of like folds in, I could go ahead and apply Subdivision Surface. I keep saying Subdivision Surface, multi-res, my bad. So subdivide, sculpt whatever I want to sculpt, and then you can bake your normal maps. We are not going to discuss how to do that, just know that it is possible, so that you could kind of look like you had a fold or a bump in this area in your normal map. And you can even import that normal map into Substance Painter to continue to apply effects after the fact. It's pretty cool stuff. It works with the Cycles rendering engine. So you'd swap your rendering engine to Cycles. You'd get a tab down here called Bake, and you can do that thing. I can send a video on that if anybody's interested. So geometry around the armpits is definitely a thing we need to care about. I'm going to use Knife because, again, I've forgotten how to apply new geometry across an edge loop. Blame my failings as a teacher for that. And we're going to go around in a circle. It's all good. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm sure it is possible. I don't remember how. I get a little bit more geometry there. It's going to bother me, though. Oh, well. Oh, loop cuts. Control R. There we go. Figured it out. Okay. I'm happy I remembered because this is integral. It's a really important detail. Control R allows you to cut along your edge loops. So if you have good quad topology, this is another reason to keep our edge loops intact. You can hit Control R and make a new cut between them and slide it along and put it in there. And that will automatically cut up the faces as well to have one face on each side of that. And if you have really good topology, you can even do that across like the armpits, like we did over here. Like, bam, there's more topology in the armpit magically. A very, very useful tool. There's another thing called insetting as well we can discuss at some point in the future. Insetting is just one more modeling tool I will briefly go into because I think it has value. It's like one of the other tools you use all the time. If I have a cylinder over here, by the way, you can hit dot on your numpad to focus on an object. If I have a cylinder over here and I want to inset this face, you can hit I in edit mode and bam, go all the way in like that. And then you can hit E to extrude downwards and you get some really cool geometry right here. Another tool, we'll cover all this in hard surface modeling, is beveling. You can hit Control B to add beveling. You can even make that beveling a little bit more detailed. Hit C to clamp it. And you can make some pretty nice looking shapes pretty quickly. 3 modeling is pretty cool. Anyway, back to the main quest and not the side quest of showing off hard surface modeling details. We're going to go back into sculpt mode. We're going to smooth out some of this new geometry we've made. We don't want it to be too far apart because we actually want some really dense geometry here. I'm just trying to make it a little bit less ugly. Same thing with like around here. These are really big quads. We want to loop cut, make them smaller. Loop cut again. Make them all about evenly spaced best we can. Looks like it didn't apply our cuts over here. To do that, we can just go knife tool. Not worry about it too much, right? At the end of the day, we're gonna spend a lot of time on our topology anyway. Might as well just do things quickly for now. Come back to it later. You'll also notice that we see this line here where it's purple in one direction and green on the other. Ashtray, that's funny. Yeah, it did kind of look like one, didn't it? That is because remember when I made that color area and the normals were incorrect, and I just said we'll worry about it later. Well, the time of reckoning has come. We need to worry about it. Luckily, it's simple. We do the same thing we did earlier. Hit A, hit Shift N. It recalculates. Everything's good. And now if we go back to our normal view mode by turning off face orientation, everything looks correct again in our matcap view because our normals are facing the right direction. And we basically already have a shirt. Like, it's not perfect. It could use a lot of work, but it is a shirt. We should probably fix the clipping in the chest area with my symmetry mode that still doesn't work. That's pretty cool. That's pretty sweet. I need to figure this out. This is going to bother the heck out of me. Our origin's in the right spot. I can even like set origin to geometry, which will put it right in the center of all of your mesh. And then sculpt. What is going on? Oh, symmetry in the Z mode works. That's a little strange. Okay, not going to worry about it. Oh, is the whole model flip-flopped? Is that what's going on? No, I don't know. Whatever. I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to apply my mirror and the Z axis and call it good. Oh, it's rotated. That's why. Our whole model is rotated 90 degrees, I think. So our rotations also get modified in that way. That's not good. We should have everything rotated and scaled correctly from the get-go here. That will apply things like bevels. If you ever notice your bevels act strangely, bevels get scaled by your scale modifier. So if your scale is, especially if it's not identical on the X, Y, and Z axes, your bevels will look kind of strange. So we can go ahead and apply our scale and rotation to zero them out. To do that, we hit Control A in object mode, and you can hit rotation and scale. We don't need to hit location or all transforms because that will move the origin of the object. We don't really care about that. And bam, we're zeroed out again. So now if we're in symmetry X and we sculpt, whoa, it works correctly, finally. We've already applied our mirror modifier at this point. Probably shouldn't have, but we can mostly just work with it as it is. It should be fine. If I were doing this myself, I would probably cut half the model off and apply mirror again, which I can go ahead and do. I do this actually a lot while I'm modeling before I've committed to any asymmetric details. Just to make sure that everything is perfectly symmetrical. If you're in edit mode, some technical details. If you're in edit mode with symmetry, vertexes will only apply correctly with their edit mode if they are in identical spots on the opposite side of the mesh. If they are even a millimeter off, they won't work at all. So like I have edit mode, I have symmetry mode on right now. I move this vertex over here. It doesn't move the identical vertex over there. Sculpt mode works a little bit differently, where it will try to find the closest vertex to that point, and you can see it with the yellow dots. So you can see there's a yellow dot right now on the right side of the screen on the right sleeve. So sculpt mode will slightly nicer apply to asymmetrical meshes, but we want it to be perfect right now because we haven't applied any asymmetrical details. So I'm going to go back into orthographic mode, go to edit, vertex mode, select all this, chop it all off, make a mirror modifier, and actually while I'm here, I could snap all this to symmetry, so I can hit Alt-click to select my edge loops where I'm supposed to be in the symmetrical area. Mesh, snap to symmetry. That didn't work. That's pretty cool. I love it when things I try to show off don't function. We might have to have the mirror modifier applied first. Let's try that. Nope. No idea what's going on there. Kind of strange. Whatever. They were basically right beforehand. Oh, they look wrong because our origin isn't correct, I don't think. And I can tell that because I tried to apply the mirror modifier and it didn't mirror directly along the axis where it was supposed to. To tell the origin of the object, we can click on it and go take a look at the transform here. We can see that our X origin is way off, actually, which is pretty cool. So before we apply our mirror modifier, I'm going to actually do that thing earlier I mentioned where we hit Control A and apply location transform. That will set the origin of the object to 0, 0, 0, which is that orange dot down there at the bottom now. And our mirror modifier now works correctly, and I bet you our snap to symmetry will as well. Bam. And it said 34 vertices already symmetrical down here at the bottom. That's another good thing to note down here is that little tooltip that applies will tell you if your operation was successful or not. And there's no like big pop-up either. Operations can just fail and it won't tell you otherwise. So look down there and you'll know. So now we could go ahead and apply our mirror modifier if we wanted to. Also worth noting while we have it here unapplied, now that we have our rotation correct, our sculpt work correctly too. So as I sculpt around here, it won't mess with those center vertices. It won't break them up. So I can do whatever I want and it will not mess them up. Unless you select them directly, it will do some weird stuff, but it seems like it's fine. So we are 6 minutes over. Boy, that went quickly. Let me turn into my notes real quick here. Worth noting on sculpt mode, let's accidentally move the mesh a little bit. That was cool. There are plenty of other tools that we can use here. I just used grab, and grab is super versatile. Draw can be nice, which will just allow you to like manually pull things out or in using the plus or minus. In the past, I had suggested that we use, where is it? Inflate for this. Inflate is typically actually a bad choice compared to draw. Inflate finds basically draws a line in from the normals into a center point and tries to move all of the objects in towards a center point. as opposed to draw, which more evenly brings things out or in. So inflate has a purpose, but typically you want to be using draw instead. Elastic deform can be good for clothes. It kind of moves everything around to simulate, well, an elastic deformation. Snake hook is valuable for more getting like, so if you want to, that's a good point. Joints. So if I'm working on a joint here, I know I have an elbow right here. I'm going to want more dense geometry right here. So we can use loop cuts, right? Loop cut, bam. We now have more dense geometry around this area. You'll see that fingers will often have this. This Avi is a terrible example because it's a robot, but fingers will oftentimes have way more geometry around their joints. If we want to make some folds in an object, that snake hook can be cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to like to exaggerate. I'm going to make a whole bunch of extra geometry in this area, and then I'm going to sculpt in some cool folds, right? So I can take the snake hook here and click and drag and kind of do some weird shit like this, right? I'm going to move in, kind of do some weird funkiness, maybe smooth it out a little bit by shift clicking, move some of that inwards a little bit. You get the idea. You can make some nice little deformations that make it look more organic. There is cloth simulation as well. Down here in this cloth over here, we can mess around with this. And what this will do is it effectively does a very simple cloth simulation to try to make it look like it's more clothy. Apparently it does not respect symmetry very well. Good to know. There are more complex cloth simulations in Blender worth knowing about. In this physics tab over here, there's collision, I believe, and cloth. You can use these things. Very few people I know actually do. There's other tooling as well that makes clothing. Marvelous Designer is a tool that is outrageously expensive. It's like $40 a month. Ridiculous. That is great for making clothing for what it's worth. Like, it's pretty cool. It does cloth simulation, a whole bunch of stuff. You import your base into it. You make cuts of fabric. You sew those cuts of fabric together. It's kind of cool. Oh, what else do I want to cover? Go real quick here. There's an entire topic about seams and sharps that we're going to have to talk about in the future, as well as making, I call them dangly things. Wow, that's a terrible name for that. If you want to make like straps, for example, like let's say we want our shirt to have, if we were making like a hoodie, you'd kind of want like a little strap coming down the side. So you could do like a little plane just to kind of show off what it would look like. Something like that, Mirror to our body, find the right good spot for it. Move it over, extend this down a whole bunch. Sure, that's close enough. And then maybe solidify it to give it some thickness. Maybe use a bevel modifier to make it a little bit more round, and then apply all that using Control A to apply. And bam, you have straps for your hoodie. We will discuss in the future how to add bones to these straps and use envelope weight painting to automatically weight paint them, and then how to give them fizz bones and then fizz bone colliders in Unity so that they move around on the Avi. In addition, we're going to talk about seams for UVing and how to do UV maps in general, because after we've made this whole hoodie, we have to UV it before we can texture it. And sharps. Sharps, right now, everything is shade flat. As we've talked about in the past, there's also this option to shade smooth, which will make everything nice and smooth across the shirt. There are times where you don't want them to be smooth, though, and you want it to have a bit of a crease to it. You can do that using sharps, which is this mark sharp right here. And then you will notice, if I accentuate this a little bit, that even in our shade smooth, there's a clear definition between these two normals, as opposed to if it were not sharp, that it would blend across and you wouldn't see any clear definition there. Lots of other things to discuss. Let's double check here. We're going to discuss in the future avoiding clipping as well. So there are ways for us to, in addition to just having good geometry, for us to avoid clipping of the Avi so that things don't, so the body doesn't clip through the shirt, including UV discards, and then also using blend shapes to shrink down the body, and how to apply all of those. I already mentioned UV mapping. There's plenty to talk about there. That's a whole class in and of itself. And then eventually I would love to discuss Substance Painter as well. So Substance Painter is what I use to texture all of my clothes. Blender does have built-in texturing. I don't really use it anymore. I used it when I first learned, and then I moved on to Substance Painter and haven't looked back. In the spirit of keeping this class accessible, I'm not sure if I should cover Substance Painter in any real detail, but I'll at least gloss over it, and then maybe do a dedicated class at some point for people who are interested.